Hello, my name is Rafal Chomik and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Excellence in Population Aging Research. It's great to be here. Thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to give you this introduction to population aging. So what's the big deal? Often population aging is described in very dramatic terms, a tsunami or a demographic crisis or aging time bomb. I read the other day when describing aging in China, someone said it was a grey wall of China. One of the things that people forget when talking about it as a crisis is that it's actually a good news story of people living massively longer, healthier lives. Secondly, it's probably gentler metaphors that might be appropriate, so like a rising tide rather than a tsunami, but still, superlatives do indeed apply. These are the terms that the UN used when describing population aging at its 2002 World Forum. It said, "It is unprecedented. There are no parallels in human history, pervasive, a global phenomenon every country is experiencing, except perhaps the most war-torn ones. It's enduring. We will not return to younger populations that our ancestors knew, and profound because it has implications for many facets of human life." I'll talk about just the economic and public finance aspects in this presentation. So in this talk, I'll give you an impression of what is happening with the age structure of the population and how we might measure it. In parts 2, 3, and 4, I want to give you the demographic, macroeconomic, and microeconomic policy building blocks, which I then bring together when I explain the fiscal challenge in part 5 and the policy responses when I conclude in part 6. The key question I want to answer by the end is how to respond to the fiscal challenge of population aging. So the focus is on public finance issues, the type you would face as someone working at the Treasury, the Department for Social Services, or the Department of Health. And in fact, I hope that by the end, you should be able to fully understand what is known as the intergenerational report, a regular report that looks at these topics in more detail. So one popular way to visualize aging is by looking at a population pyramid. Here you can see the Australian population pyramid at Federation. The pyramid starts out concave with lots of young people at the bottom and a sharp tip with fewer older people at the top. It actually resembles the kind of population pyramid that you might expect of a developing country. As we move through the decades, and I'm about to start the animation to show you that concavity will disappear. The peak becomes more rounded and fills up with older people. In the 1950s and 60s, you can see the baby boomers coming through. And then finally, as the pyramid takes shape, it looks more like a column and not a pyramid at all. That is the projection for Australia. If you're interested in the extreme scenario, look no further than Japan, which actually has an inverted pyramid with lots more older people at the top. Another way to look at aging is to consider average age. Here's the median age, 1901 through to 2050 for the Australian population. So at Federation, if you were 22, half of Australians were younger, and then half were older than you. If you're 22 now, there is a higher proportion that are older and a smaller proportion that are younger than you. The median age is about 37, 38, and that median age will go up to 42 by 2050. You can also look at the shares of population groups in the overall population. So you can see here share of older people, children, and working age, traditional working age. The historical data usually reveal an ebb and flow of the numbers of children and working age people due to wars and famines. But something entirely different happened in the 20th century. Older people increased from about 4% in 1901 to 14% now. By 2025, more than children, and by 2050 their share will be quarter to a fifth of the population of Australia. And if you look across the world, there's only a few countries that had that proportion of older people in its population, only 3 in 2010, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Whereas by 2050, many more countries reach this threshold. So Australia, as well as most of its trading partners, have much more older people as a proportion of the population. So that's lots of different measures, but probably the most popular measure used by demographers is the dependency ratio. This is the proportion of people over 65 for every 100 people of traditional working age, 15 to 64. Here it's shown for 1901 through to 2050, going from below 10 to 20 to 38. The inverse of that dependency ratio is the support ratio. So now the support ratio is about 5, which means about 5 people working age for every 1 person aged 65 plus, and that will go up to about 3 working age people for every older person in 2050. In international comparisons, we see again Japan soar. The US has similar levels to us, similar levels of aging. China, though younger currently, is going to become much older by 2050. And India is an example of a country that's aging much slower. Indonesia and the Philippines are in a similar boat. But what about the causes? Well, to understand the underlying drivers of these trends, you require 3 parts: life expectancy, fertility, and migration. So here's life expectancy. Now remember here that this is a good news story, that healthier lifestyles and declines in infectious diseases and better medicine have meant that Australian life expectancy has increased from about 50s to about a bit over 80 now, and up another 4 years by 2050. You can see the speed of the change in Japan, which is much more dramatic, partly explains the aging story there. On the projections, the types of projections that you see in this chart are often based on past trends with some modifications. So in Australia, in the past 40 years, we've seen about an increase to life expectancy of about 2 to 4 months per year, but these UN estimates assume about 1 to 2 months per year in the next 40 years. One of the things that you would notice if you looked at historic attempts at this kind of projection is that people kept on underestimating life expectancy increases. One of the reasons for that most recently is that most of the gains in the past were at younger ages. So most people at younger ages are now surviving, almost the whole cohort is, which means that there's not a lot more gain there. So in future, life expectancy increases will be about extending the lives of the oldest old. There's another point here that I want to make about the measure of life expectancy itself. It's often misunderstood, and you guys will probably know about this, but the most often quoted number is what is called the period life expectancy, which is the calculation of a hypothetical life for whom the probability of death at each age is applied based on the probability observed in a given year. That means that, for example, we know what the survival is between age 0 and 1, and between age 1 and 2 and 3, etc. in 2018. But by the time someone who is born in 2018 reaches, say, 20, those probabilities would have improved. So to apply the probability of survival between age 20 and 21 from 2018 to someone born in 2018 is probably inaccurate. So what I'm saying is that the period life expectancy is a summary measure of population health for that year that takes account of improvements up to that point, but not in the future. Cohort life expectancy, however, does take account of future improvements. So if you guys will, on average, live much longer than 80 years, so in fact, you guys will live much longer than 80 years suggested in this chart. It's not an easy distinction, but one that is very important for you guys to understand. Sorry for covering old ground. And here is, as I mentioned, to show you just the improvements of survival rates by age that I mentioned. In red was 1890 to 1950, and in grey 1950 to 2010. First, most improvements were with infant mortality, that big red bar, and most recently improvements have been at later ages. If you split the second period into 2 parts, that same trend will appear. So the second part of the demographic transition is declines in fertility, which usually takes place after life expectancy increases and children are surviving longer. Here I break these down into the number of children per woman by age group of women. The red lines are the historic rates, and then the black lines are the projection. What you see is declines from younger age groups in the top 3 panels and increases in fertility of the older age groups. So some of it is to do with delayed childbearing, but if you total them up, as you'll see in the next slide, we get total fertility rate, and the overall trend has been a decline. So since 1901, you can see there the baby boom, and then the contraceptive pill was introduced in the 1960s. Australia is actually typical of OECD countries, but the context I show here is fertility of Japan and China. There are different stages of the demographic transition, but both see much more dramatic changes than Australia. Also in recent times, low-income families have reduced fertility, whereas richer families have had more children in comparison, a reversal of the past trend. Again, I would note that the total fertility rate is a period measure of fertility, which is the number of children that will be born alive to a woman during her lifetime if she were to pass through all her childbearing years conforming to the age-specific rates of a given year, similar to what I said about the period life expectancy. And then the third part of the puzzle is the demographic elements of migration. This chart shows you the net migration as a proportion of the total population. The red line is the historic rates, which were high post-war and the recent boom, and low levels during economic troughs. The future is assumed to revert to a mean for Australia, which is, compared to OECD countries, is actually quite high. And the reason why migration is relevant to the age structure is because the migrants tend to be younger, and you can see that in the red element of the bar. You can see that more of them are aged 15 to 24 than the general population. Now I want to spend a few slides talking about labour force participation and productivity. And this is an important part of the discussion about population ageing because they can mitigate the decrease in the working age population when it comes to economic activity. So when you have more older people in the population and fewer working age people, you might expect that there are fewer people participating in the labour market, unless there are older people who are working more or women participating more in the labour market. And you can see both of those elements here. This is the rates of labour force participation for women aged 55 to 64 in Australia against some of the best performers in the OECD and the average for OECD. You can see Australia moving from a low base, but a much more rapid increase than the OECD, which is still behind such countries as New Zealand and the USA. New Zealand's increase is most striking. One of the big reasons is the incentives put in place in the pension system, such as, for example, no means test that allows people to keep working and still receive a full pension. The trends for labour force participation of older men is a little bit different. There's been declines in the 80s and 90s, which was common across the OECD, before a more recent increase in the last couple of decades. The increases have been down to people being healthier, more educated, physically easier jobs and service jobs, and more self-employed people, which is associated with working longer. But if you do have more older people and they're not necessarily all working longer, then one way of resolving some of the issues is to make sure that there's productivity of the remaining labour force that is increasing. The growth in labour force productivity is measured by the amount of GDP that you can generate per hour worked. So for example, if you get more money this year for the same amount of hours you put in last year, that means your productivity is increased. And if we measure that and scale it to the whole economy, that's what labour force productivity growth means here. The measure, as you can see in this chart, is quite erratic. In future, for various reasons, there's presumption that productivity will slow down. So we've talked about the population, its level of participation in the labour force, and its productivity. And now I just want to bring those together to talk about what that means for the size of the economy. And that's described in this obscure formulation here. What we do is you take the total adult population, multiply out by the level at which it participates in the labor force, and multiply out by the employment rate, which takes out people who are unemployed, and the average hours worked, and then you get the total hours worked in that economy. If you then multiply those total hours by the level of productivity, then you get the GDP output. So this is a method that the GDP, known as GDP accounting, that the Treasury often calls the 3P framework, which relates to population, participation, and productivity. Okay, so that's some of the economic context. What about some of the policies that are very relevant for population aging? Here I will talk about pensions, health, and aged care. So a common way to think about the pension system is to split it into three functional parts. The first tier has a function of income adequacy. So it's about a safety net that's there to make sure that people aren't poor in retirement. It can be universal, given to anyone over a certain age, or targeted, which means that only poorer people receive the pension. A second tier is about income smoothing. So smoothing income from working life through to retirement. It's a type of insurance to make sure that you don't get a big drop in income in retirement. The distinction within this tier is that you can have one which is pay as you go, so contributions from current taxpayers go to pay for current pensioners, or a funded system based on assets which are then sold in future, essentially to future workers, and then older people can live off those assets. A third tier is a voluntary savings scheme, so for example housing might be an important part, or shares or stocks. So let me just give you some examples to clarify. So first, an international example, here's Germany. Germany has a very small basic safety net for everyone, but few actually receive this. It's actually quite typical of more developed countries. The main source of retirement income in Germany is the earnings-related scheme. Now, earnings-related means that if you earn more in working life, you'll receive more in retirement, based on an often outdated formula. It's the sort of scheme that you hear referred to as social security. For example, the US also has one. Crucial here is that it is a pay-as-you-go system, so current worker contributions are paying for current retirees. The problem arises that when the demographics change and that formula doesn't change, more pensioners are living longer and receiving more pensions, and there are fewer workers to pay for those pensions. So in Germany and other countries that have had these systems, they've had to really scale back some of the promises of the formulas that they've had, and that's sometimes caused riots in Europe. So the Australian pension system is somewhat atypical of a developed country. It also operates differently to what I've just described for Germany. It also has a targeted age pension, but that pension is more generous and goes to more people than the safety nets that other countries tend to have. However, it's less generous than the second-tier earnings-related schemes, which means that Australia's main form of public support for retirement income is one where, rather than increase with people's earnings, it reduces as people become richer. And it does that via a means test. So you look at the assets and incomes that people have, and you reduce the pension based on a certain taper as incomes and assets increase. So when Australia did introduce a second-tier scheme, its income smoothing scheme, it made it private and funded. And that's the superannuation guarantee. So as super increases in size and importance, government budgets are expected to improve. But if people's outcomes in working life, and by the time they get to retirement, are worse off, there is still the age pension scheme that goes to about 2/3 of the older population. Finally, there are tax incentives to save more into super than the mandated level, and those tax incentives indeed do have some cost that should be recognized and has a distributional impact, which are controversial, but that topic is probably for another day. Also not shown here is savings in homes, which is a very big part in Australia. So about 50% of savings are in the family home. And when you get to retirement and you do own your own home, you tend to you don't have to pay as much in housing costs, which is a form of implicit rent that you receive from having owned the home. So now it's worth pausing and thinking about the share of private and public provision of retirement income manifest in the mandatory design of the system. So this is based on the idea of the replacement rate. The replacement rate essentially measures the proportion of earnings before retirement that are replaced with retirement income. So for example, I earn $100 per week before retirement and I receive $60 a week in retirement, then the replacement is 60%. So this chart here shows you the replacement rate an average worker would receive with a full working history. In Australia, about 45% of income would be replaced by super and about 15% of their income by the age pension. So in total, they'd get that about 60% replacement rate. By contrast, most other countries rely on a system that replaces income primarily from public sources. Greece, you can see at the top there, is particularly generous. These are slightly older numbers, but many would still be accurate. In reality, there is a non-mandatory private savings as well that would be added to the replacement rates that people would receive. And also note that the levels are from 2008, so they exclude all sorts of things like an increase to the pension age and increase to the mandatory contribution, which are now going up. So the result of the accumulation in super is a very large pool of funds here in Australia. And you can see in this chart here that as a proportion of GDP, Australia has some of the largest accumulations of funded pensions. And having discussed the various elements, the question is, well, what are the outcomes for government expenditure? And if you look at this chart here, you can see that we are third lowest in the OECD when it comes to spending on pensions. And if you look at projections, which I haven't shown here, we will remain amongst the lowest spending countries on retirement income. What about health? So I won't describe the health system in full, and in fact you guys are probably experts at this already, but there's several principles to note about it when it comes to public finance. It is tax funded with a basic universal provision for equity reasons. There is some means testing and targeting and co-payments to control costs. There is a private insurance market to extend the quality of some of the services and include risk pooling among them. And government acts as mostly the major single payer, trying to exercise economies of scale when it comes to pharmaceuticals, for example, not as successfully as some countries have done, however. And when it comes to an aging population context, it's important to recognize the levels of health need within a health system. As a proxy for that, I have here the causes of death, communicable injury, and NCDs, non-communicable diseases. And then we know that societies, as they industrialize, develop, and age, NCDs become more important, which you'll know as the epidemiological transition. These NCDs, as well as their chronic multi-morbidity nature, require a very different form of health intervention than needed in the past. So as services change, the cost is more tech-intensive and costly, and aging means that they are expanded to a greater share of the population. So you'd expect that higher health spending would be one major result. And on current projections, that's what you see, that Australian public health spending will nearly double as a proportion of GDP by 2060, based on current policy trends. Not all of that is due to aging, but a good chunk of it is. And so in fact, there's a lot of research that really needs to go into this area to understand how to improve some of the efficiencies and how to best respond to an aging demographic. In fact, I think we're probably at a tipping point when it comes to the importance of investment in research in these areas. But I just want to underline that health spending has various determinants, and that aging is just one of them. So here you can see the total expenditure on health, and you'll note that the US is really the odd one out, spending much more than most. Australia is in the bottom half of this chart. It's also in the bottom half if you look at just public spending, not just total. And note that Japan is below the OECD average, and we know that Japan is the oldest country in the world. So it is able to actually deliver health spending, health outcomes with much lower levels of spending. Of course, when you have to care for people in the absence of cure and those illnesses that they have are chronic and non-acute, you're talking about aged care policy. Outside Australia, aged care is known as long-term care or elder care in some countries, or social care, for example in the UK. So this is the final area that I just want to talk about. Aged care usually takes two forms, home or residential care. About 12% of Australians 65 plus are within an aged care program, and it's about half-half when it comes to home and aged care in a residential setting. As you can see, countries with higher aged care participation have actually higher levels of people in residential care. But one way to reduce spending is to provide more home care in place of residential care. And that's actually a win-win in many ways, because that's what older people always tend to say that they would prefer, rather than going into a nursing home. When it comes to expenditure, you can see this split into public and private here. In Australia, almost all of it is public spending. Government spends about 1% of GDP or so on aged care. And even though that's a low amount, and there is some co-payments and means testing in place, aged care is actually one of the fastest growing items of the expenditure in the next 10 years when it comes to projection by the government itself. So now I just want to bring some of those together. So we've talked about how GDP is affected by aging, and we've talked about how specific programs are affected by aging and the different designs that you might choose for them. And this is the result when it comes to major budget components currently and in the future. And you can see the projection suggests that spending on health, aged care and pensions are expected to increase compared to others which are expected to decline. Overall, spending on current policy measures is expected to increase. Now, at a given level of taxes, the result is projection in spending exceeding revenue by about 2.75% in the next 40 years' time. So that is the public finance challenge of population aging. Now, how to respond to it, you'll have your own views, but there's some that I've already given you throughout this presentation, so let's go through them now. So like I said, the building blocks to answer the question of how a society responds to the fiscal challenge of population aging have been scattered throughout this presentation. A society might choose to invest more in the productivity of a smaller workforce by educating it better, or making sure that it's got the capital and technology in place to make it more productive. It could increase migration or implement active population policies to change the age structure of the population. It could encourage and enable older people to work longer and increase labor force participation, perhaps also for women. It could contain future pension costs via greater private savings or better means testing of the age pension. It could contain future health costs via the reforms at market level and preventative health at individual level, looking at examples such as Japan about how it's been able to get the outcomes that it has for low levels of spending compared to other countries, and perhaps learn from countries such as the US for what not to do. Controversially, it could also lower the standards of living of older people by just cutting benefits. It's probably not a preferable option, but that's what some governments have chosen to do. It could also increase taxes, which essentially means lowering the potential standard of living of younger people. However, it depends on what the distributional impact of those taxes is. So is it the richer people that pay for them, or is it distributed throughout the younger population? So that really gives you the various examples. Perhaps you have other examples there as well. But essentially, there's two parts to it. One of them is to increase the size of the economy. Those are some of the first points that I've got there. And the second part is looking at specific programs which and seeing how efficient they are and whether they can be improved. And finally, whether tweaks of the benefits versus the revenues are changed. So the overall takeaways from this presentation, I hope, is that you realize that population aging is a big deal, even though some of the metaphors are misplaced. It is unprecedented, enduring, pervasive, and profound. The other thing to remember is that GDP is as an important part to it as the programs themselves, and that Australia is in relatively good shape given its level of migration, its structure of pension system and health policies, but major and innovative policy and practice reforms will be necessary to manage some of the demographic change effectively and keep programs efficient. Thank you very much. So that is just one aspect of population aging that I've covered, but there's lots of other info on our website, so do check it out. If there are questions that you have for me, then please feel free to get in touch, and good luck.